Have you ever heard a 130 decibel air raid siren go off at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday while you're holding a fresh, scalding hot cup of coffee? I have. Because I built it. And my neighbor Brenda deserves every single ruptured eardrum she gets. It all started when I bought a place in Amarillo, Texas. If you've never been to Amarillo, let me paint you a picture. It is flat, it is yellow, and the wind blows so hard and so constantly that you start to wonder if the earth is just breathing heavily right in your face. I'm a guy who likes his peace, quiet, and a good weekend project, so the property was perfect. It had a big backyard, a solid fence, and enough distance from the city center to make me feel like I had my own little slice of the world. I'm also somewhat of a hobbyist when it comes to off-grid tinkering. I like building things that serve a purpose, especially if it saves me a few bucks on the electric bill. So naturally, considering I was living in a wind tunnel, I decided to build a windmill. I'm not talking about one of those massive three-pronged industrial turbines that look like they belong on an alien spaceship. I built a beautiful, quaint, 5-foot-tall wooden windmill. It had cedar blades, a nice rustic stain, and a small, completely silent alternator tucked inside the housing. It was hooked up to a simple battery bank that powered the string lights around my patio, and a little water feature I'd put in for the local birds. It was utterly harmless. It made zero noise. It just sat there, spinning lazily, or sometimes aggressively, in the relentless Texas breeze, doing its job. I loved it. My friends thought it was cool. Even the birds seemed to appreciate the aesthetic. But Brenda did not. Brenda lived in the house to my immediate left. She was a woman who seemingly had no job, no hobbies, and no joy, operating entirely on a diet of boxed wine and neighborhood surveillance. She wasn't technically the HOA president, mostly because we didn't live in an HOA. We were in a standard municipal residential zone, but Brenda acted like she was the supreme commander of an invisible homeowners association that existed strictly within the confines of her own mind. She always wore this tinted tactical sun visor like she was ready to play high-stakes poker or referee a tennis match, and she never went anywhere without a pleather clipboard. The first time she confronted me about the windmill, I was in the middle of staining my deck. "Excuse me," a voice barked over the fence. I looked up, wiping sweat from my forehead. Brenda was standing at the edge of my property line, her hands planted firmly on her hips. Flanking her ankles were two identical, shivering Shih Tzus that looked like they were perpetually vibrating out of sheer anxiety. "Can I help you?" I asked, putting my brush down. That spinning monstrosity," she pointed a sharp, manicured finger at my little cedar windmill. "It is an eyesore, and it is a severe distraction to my purebreds." I blinked, looking from her to the dogs, and then back to the windmill. It was quietly turning, powering a small fountain. "You mean the windmill? It's just wood, Brenda. It's not making any noise." "It's the motion," she snapped, adjusting her tactical visor. "The shadow flicker. Every time the sun hits it, the shadow sweeps across my rose bushes. It's causing me emotional distress. Buster hasn't had a solid bowel movement in 3 days because he's terrified of it." "Brenda, respectfully, I think Buster's bowel movements are between him and God," I said, trying to keep a straight face. "The windmill is on my property. It's fully up to code, and it's barely taller than the fence. I'm not taking it down." "We'll see about that," she sneered, jotting something down on her clipboard with aggressive force. You have no idea who you are dealing with. I have the city council on speed dial." I laughed it off. I genuinely thought she was just one of those eccentric neighbors you have to ignore. I went back to staining my deck, assuming that was the end of it. I was incredibly, naively wrong. 3 days later, the first certified letter arrived. It was from the Amarillo Department of Code Enforcement. Brenda hadn't just complained. She had launched a full-scale bureaucratic siege. The letter stated that an anonymous neighbor had reported an unauthorized, unpermitted, and visually disruptive mechanical structure on my property. They gave me a warning and demanded I cease all operation of the device. I was annoyed, but I figured it was a misunderstanding. I took pictures of the windmill, printed out the city ordinances regarding yard structures, and went down to the municipal building. I showed the clerk that the windmill was well under the height limit for a backyard structure and that it didn't violate any property line setbacks. The clerk, a nice woman who looked like she wanted to be anywhere else, stamped my paper and said I was fine. I went home, feeling victorious. I made eye contact with Brenda through her kitchen window and gave her a cheerful thumbs up. She slammed her blinds shut. A week later, things escalated. I was sitting on my couch watching the game when I saw red and blue lights flashing through my front window. I frowned, put my beer down, and walked out the front door. 2 Amarillo PD squad cars were parked blocking my driveway. 2 officers were walking up the path, their hands resting casually on their utility belts. They looked utterly exhausted. "Hey, officers," I called out, leaning against the doorframe. "Everything okay?" The older officer, a guy with a thick mustache and a look of profound weariness, sighed. "Are you David?" "Dave, yeah. What's going on?" "We got a call about a disturbance," the younger cop said, glancing toward Brenda's house. "Specifically, a public nuisance violation regarding a mechanical wind device." I couldn't believe it. "You're kidding me. She called the cops over a wooden windmill?" "Look, man," the older cop said, taking off his hat and rubbing his head. "We know it's just a windmill. We drove by it. It's a nice piece of woodworking. But she's citing City Nuisance Ordinance 8.14. She's been calling dispatch every hour for the last 4 hours, saying the shadow flicker is causing her severe emotional distress and constitutes a hostile living environment." "A hostile living environment?" I echoed, my voice rising in disbelief. "It's a piece of wood spinning in the wind. It makes less noise than her breathing." "I get it, buddy," the older officer said sympathetically. "But here's the problem. Code enforcement got involved again. Apparently she dug up some obscure zoning regulation. Since you don't have agricultural zoning, and the structure isn't registered as a primary utility source for the dwelling, it doesn't meet the criteria for a permitted structural utility purpose." I stared at him. "So let me get this straight. I'm being penalized because the sun exists, the wind blows, and I built a garden ornament?" "Welcome to Amarillo," the younger cop muttered. "She pushed it up to the district supervisor," the older cop explained, handing me a pink slip of paper. "This is an official citation. If you don't dismantle the structure by Friday, code enforcement is going to fine you $500 a day until it's gone." I looked down at the laminated pink slip. A $500 a day fine. For a garden windmill. I looked over at Brenda's house. She was standing on her porch, her arms crossed, a smug, triumphant smile plastered across her face. She had actually won. She had weaponized the local government, found a ridiculous technicality, and forced the police to do her bidding. "Just take it down, Dave," the older officer said gently, clapping me on the shoulder. "It's not worth the money. People like her, they don't stop. They have nothing but time." "Yeah," I said quietly, gripping the citation in my hand. Thanks, officers. Have a good night. I watched them drive away. I stood in the driveway for a long time, the relentless Amarillo wind whipping at my shirt. I looked at Brenda, who was still smirking from her porch. Did I back down? Did I dismantle the beautiful, eco-friendly project I spent 3 weekends building just because a miserable woman with a clipboard found a zoning loophole? Absolutely not. I walked inside, locked the door, grabbed a fresh beer, and fired up my laptop. I cracked my knuckles. If Brenda wanted to play the technicality game, she was about to learn that I was playing on a completely different level. It was time to read the law. I cracked my knuckles, took a long sip of my beer, and stared into the glowing abyss of my laptop screen. The Amarillo Municipal Government website looks like it was coded by a high school sophomore in 1998 who just discovered HTML tables. It's a labyrinth of dead links, poorly scanned PDFs, and bureaucratic jargon designed specifically to make you give up and pay whatever fine they throw at you. But I was not going to give up. Brenda had started a war of technicalities, and I was going to finish it. I started digging into the specific ordinance the cops had cited. City Nuisance Ordinance 8.14. It was a broad, sweeping law that basically boiled down to, if your neighbor finds something annoying and it doesn't have a legally protected utility purpose, it's a nuisance. Because my property wasn't zoned for agricultural use, my windmill didn't qualify as a primary power generator, and because Brenda claimed the shadow flicker was causing her emotional distress, it failed the aesthetic exemption. Code enforcement had me boxed in perfectly. I spent 3 days deep in the legal trenches. I read through Title IV on zoning. I read through Title VIII on health and safety. I drank so much coffee my resting heart rate felt like a drum solo. I was looking for anything: a grandfather clause, an obscure property rights statute, a loophole the size of a Texas steering wheel. On the third night, around 2:30 a.m., my eyes bloodshot and my patience wearing paper thin, I found it. It wasn't in the zoning laws. It was buried deep in the Amarillo noise and environmental safety regulations, cross-referenced with Texas state government code regarding residential safety devices. I was reading through the decibel limit restrictions for residential neighborhoods, the laws that stop you from blasting death metal at 3 a.m. or running a chainsaw all night, when I saw a tiny, beautiful subsection. Subsection C, Exemptions. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart starting to pound. The decibel limits, structural utility requirements, and residential nuisance restrictions outlined in Chapters 8 and 12 shall not apply to the installation, testing, or operation of registered emergency meteorological warning devices, agricultural safety alarms, or municipal alert systems. I read it again, and then a third time. I started laughing. It was a low, slightly unhinged chuckle that echoed in my empty living room. The city said my windmill had no permitted utility purpose because it just powered some garden lights. But what if it didn't power garden lights? What if the windmill itself was the trigger mechanism for a personal meteorological warning system? What if its sole legal utility was high wind safety? Under Texas law, you are allowed to have a weather alarm on your property. In fact, in Tornado Alley, it's practically encouraged. And the law explicitly stated that these safety devices were entirely exempt from nuisance claims, decibel limits, and HOA-style eyesore complaints. If I re-registered my beautiful, silent wooden windmill as the power source and trigger for an emergency meteorological warning device, Brenda couldn't do a damn thing about it. Code enforcement couldn't touch it. But a warning device has to actually warn people. If I was going to use this loophole, I had to comply maliciously. I needed an alarm. And if Brenda was going to complain about the silence of a spinning piece of cedar, I was going to give her something to actually complain about. I immediately opened a new tab and went to eBay. I didn't want a little digital beep. I didn't want a car alarm. I wanted auditory devastation. I typed "industrial factory siren" into the search bar. After scrolling past a few dinky little fire alarm bells, I found the Holy Grail. A user named Doomsday Prepper Dan in Ohio was selling a vintage, fully restored 1960s Federal Signal Model 2. If you don't know what that is, imagine a 200-pound hunk of yellow-painted steel that looks like a jet engine and was originally designed to warn entire towns that the Soviet Union had launched nukes, or that a Category 5 tornado was actively ripping the town hall apart. It ran on 220 volts. It possessed a decibel rating of 130 dB at 100 feet. For context, a rock concert is about 120 decibels. 130 decibels is the threshold of physical pain. I clicked "Buy it now" so fast I almost broke my mouse. The shipping cost more than the siren itself, but I didn't care. This was an investment in justice. 4 days later, a freight truck backed into my driveway. The delivery guy looked at me like I was insane as we unloaded a massive wooden crate using a pallet jack. I pried the crate open with a crowbar, and there it was. It smelled like machine oil, ozone, and Cold War anxiety. It was absolutely magnificent. Now, I am a handy guy, but I am not wire a 220-volt air raid siren to a wooden windmill without electrocuting myself handy. I needed professionals. Plus, if code enforcement came sniffing around, I needed licensed contractors' signatures on the installation paperwork to prove it was a legitimate, permitted safety device. I called up 2 local guys who came highly recommended. Mike, a master electrician who drove a pristine white transit van, and Tony, a rigger and welder who showed up in a beat-up Ford F-250 that looked like it had survived a monster truck rally. They stood in my backyard, holding their mugs of coffee, looking from the charming cedar windmill to the terrifying yellow industrial siren sitting in the grass, and then back to me. "Let me get this straight," Mike said, pushing his hard hat back on his head. "You want me to wire this Model 2 to the alternator of that windmill?" "Not exactly," I said, handing them the blueprints I had sketched out. "I want you to wire the siren to a dedicated 220-volt breaker. But I want the relay switch connected to a digital anemometer, a wind speed sensor mounted to the windmill. When the windmill spins fast enough to register 15 miles per hour on the anemometer, it trips the relay, and the siren gets power." Tony, a big guy with a thick beard and hands the size of dinner plates, scratched his neck. "So you want this air raid siren to activate every time the wind hits 15 miles per hour?" "Exactly," I said, keeping my face completely deadpan. "It's an emergency meteorological warning device to warn the neighborhood about wind. It's a safety thing." Tony looked at Mike. Mike looked at Tony. "Bro," Tony said, slowly turning his gaze back to me. "You live in Amarillo. The wind blows 15 miles per hour every single day, usually before breakfast." "I am aware," I said. "Safety never sleeps, Tony." Mike let out a long, slow whistle. He looked over the fence at Brenda's house, then looked back at the citation I had taped to the back door for motivation. He started connecting the dots. A slow, wicked grin spread across his face. "I charge double for custom logic relay wiring," Mike said, crossing his arms. "I'll pay triple if you can get it done by tomorrow afternoon," I replied. "Deal," Tony laughed, slapping his massive hands together. "Let's mount this beast." The next 8 hours were a blur of sensory overload. The smell of burning flux and welding metal filled the backyard. Tony had to reinforce the wooden frame of the windmill with 1/4-inch steel brackets just to hold the weight of the Federal Signal Model 2. We bolted the massive yellow siren right above the rustic wooden blades. It looked absolutely absurd. It looked like someone had glued a bazooka to a rocking horse. Mike spent the afternoon running heavy-gauge conduit from my electrical panel, trenching it across the yard, and wiring it into a sophisticated digital relay box at the base of the windmill. He installed the anemometer right at the peak, calibrating it perfectly. "All right," Mike said, wiping grease off his hands with a rag. "She's wired. The relay is set to normally open. The second that little cup spinner hits 15 miles per hour, it closes the circuit, and God help us all." "We gotta test it," Tony said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a pair of heavy-duty industrial earmuffs. He handed a pair to Mike, and Mike tossed a pair to me. "Ear protection on," I commanded. We all put our muffs on. Mike walked over to the relay box. Since there was only a mild breeze at the moment, maybe 5 miles an hour, he had to manually trip the relay to simulate a 15-mile-per-hour gust. "Fire in the hole!" Mike yelled, his voice muffled through the foam of my ear protection. He pushed the manual override button. Even with the heavy-duty earmuffs on, the sound hit me like a physical punch to the chest. It didn't just make a noise, it altered the air pressure in the yard. Wah! The deep, mechanical growl spooled up into a terrifying, soul-shaking shriek. The ground vibrated. The water in my little bird fountain rippled like the T-Rex scene in Jurassic Park. It was the sound of impending doom, of tornadoes, of the apocalypse. It was beautiful. Tony actually dropped his wrench. Mike scrambled to hit the kill switch. The siren slowly wound down, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. We took our earmuffs off. "Good Lord," Tony breathed, looking at the yellow monster with newfound respect. "That is going to wake up people in New Mexico." "It's perfect," I said, pulling out my checkbook. "Boys, you did incredible work. I just have one more thing I need from you." I pulled out the official City of Amarillo emergency device registration forms. "I need your license numbers and signatures on this, verifying that you installed a high-wind meteorological safety device on my property up to city code, safely and securely." Mike chuckled as he signed his name. "You are an evil, evil man, Dave." "I'm just a citizen passionate about weather safety, Mike," I replied. I took the paperwork down to the municipal building the next morning. I handed it to the same bored clerk. She didn't even read it. She saw the licensed contractor stamps, verified the fee, hit it with a big red approved stamp, and filed it into the system. My windmill was no longer an unpermitted structural nuisance. It was a federally and municipally protected safety installation. I drove home, parked my car, and walked into my backyard. I checked the weather app on my phone. A cold front was moving in from the Panhandle. By tomorrow morning, the forecast predicted sustained winds of 20 miles per hour, with gusts up to 35. I looked over at Brenda's house. Her blinds were open. I could see her standing in her kitchen, glaring out at my property, her eyes locked on the strange new yellow device mounted to my windmill. She had her tactical visor on. She was probably already drafting another email to code enforcement. I smiled, went inside, and brewed a fresh pot of coffee. The trap was set. The legal shield was in place. All that was left to do now was wait for the wind to blow. I literally woke up the next morning and the wind was just aggressively rattling my bedroom windows. Honestly, it sounded like the house was about to take off, which in Amarillo is just a standard Tuesday. I rolled out of bed, threw on a pair of jeans and a hoodie, and walked into the kitchen to brew some coffee. I was, practically buzzing with anticipation. I guess you could call it petty, but when someone tries to legally bully you out of enjoying your own backyard, you tend to wake up feeling a little vindictive. I poured my coffee, walked over to the sliding glass door, and peered through the blinds. The sky was that bruised, stormy, purple-gray color, and the trees were already bending sideways. And right there, standing on her pristine concrete patio, was Brenda. She was wearing her tactical visor, a thick quilted vest, and she was gripping a steaming mug with both hands, just staring at my windmill, or rather staring at the massive, terrifying yellow mechanical tumor I had bolted to the top of it. She looked confused, obviously, but also incredibly smug. I could literally see the gears turning in her head, probably trying to figure out if she could cite me for painting a structure a non-approved color. I glanced up at the digital readout I'd wired to the inside of my kitchen wall. The anemometer was tracking the wind speed. 9 miles per hour, 11 miles per hour, 13 miles per hour. The wind was gusting, building its strength. I took a sip of my coffee. The digital readout flashed to 14. I saw Brenda pull her phone out of her vest pocket, probably dialing code enforcement right then and there to report the weird yellow thing. The readout hit 15. You know how in movies, right before a nuclear bomb goes off, there's that split second where everything just goes perfectly, terrifyingly silent? It was like that. And then, the relay clicked shut. Wow! The Federal Signal Model 2 didn't just turn on, it detonated into existence. The sheer auditory violence of it literally shook the glass in my sliding door. I had earplugs in my pocket, but I didn't even put them in because I was so mesmerized by what was happening outside. Brenda dropped her coffee mug. It shattered on her concrete patio, hot liquid splashing all over her sensible shoes. But she didn't even notice. She physically leaped into the air, screaming, her hands flying up to cover her ears. The dogs, Buster and whatever the other trembling furball was named, bolted in opposite directions, practically doing cartoon burnouts on the grass before diving under her porch. The siren howled, a deep, mechanical, soul-vibrating wail that seemed to rattle my very teeth. It held that ear-splitting 130-decibel scream for a solid 10 seconds as the wind gusted. And then, the wind dipped. 14 miles per hour. The relay opened. Power cut off. The siren slowly, agonizingly wound down, pitching lower and lower until it died with a metallic groan. Complete, ringing silence fell over the neighborhood. I opened my sliding glass door and stepped out onto the patio. Brenda was frozen in place, her hands still clamped over her ears, her eyes wide with unadulterated horror. She slowly lowered her hands, looking around frantically like we had just been invaded by a hostile foreign military. "Good morning, Brenda," I yelled over the fence, waving my coffee mug at her. "Looks like we've got some high winds coming in today." She snapped her head toward me, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. She marched toward the fence line, her face turning the color of an overripe tomato. What is that?" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the yellow beast atop the windmill. "What did you just do?" "Oh, that?" I said casually, taking a sip of my coffee. "That's my new emergency meteorological warning device. You see, the city informed me that my windmill didn't have a legally permitted utility purpose, so I updated it. It's now the power and trigger mechanism for a personal weather safety siren. It activates whenever the wind hits 15 miles per hour to warn us about potentially dangerous meteorological conditions. "Turn it off," she screamed. "Turn it off right now! That is a noise violation! That is illegal! I am calling the police! I am calling the mayor!" I was about to respond, but a sudden gust of wind ripped through the yard. The blades on the cedar windmill spun into a blur. Click. Wah! The siren blasted again, drowning out whatever Brenda was trying to say. I could see her mouth moving furiously, her face practically turning purple, but I couldn't hear a single syllable over the apocalyptic wail of the Model 2. I just smiled, tapped the side of my head, and gave her a thumbs up. The siren blared for a full 30 seconds this time, before the wind dipped below the threshold. "Put you in jail! I am going to have you arrested!" Brenda was screaming at the top of her lungs the second the noise cut out. "I literally can't turn it off, Brenda!" I shouted back, maintaining my overly cheerful, deeply annoying customer service voice. "It's a federally compliant meteorological warning system. It's an automated safety protocol. If I disable it, I'd be compromising the safety of the entire neighborhood." "It's a nuisance!" she screeched, aggressively tapping her clipboard against the wooden fence. "It's an assault! You are assaulting me with sound!" Click. Wah! This was the beauty of Amarillo, Texas. The wind doesn't just blow once. It is a relentless, punishing force of nature. For the next hour, every 3 to 4 minutes, the wind would crest 15 miles per hour, and the siren would unleash its fury upon the earth. It was a symphony of spite. It was glorious. I went back inside, closed the door, and actually put my earplugs in, settling onto the couch with my laptop. I knew what was coming. I was just waiting for the cavalry to arrive. It took exactly 45 minutes. I saw the flashing lights pull up to the curb. It was the same 2 cops from before, and they looked absolutely miserable. Trailing behind them was a white city-owned pickup truck with the Amarillo Code Enforcement seal on the side. A tall, skinny guy with a clipboard, let's call him Gary, stepped out of the truck. He was wearing noise-canceling construction earmuffs. The cops were physically holding their hands over their ears as they walked up my driveway. I walked out the front door, slipping my own earplugs out just enough to hear. Brenda was already there, practically vibrating with hysterical rage, screaming at Gary and the officers. "Arrest him! Confiscate that weapon of mass destruction! He is terrorizing the neighborhood!" Brenda shrieked, clutching Gary's arm. Gary gently pulled his arm away and looked at me as I walked up. He pulled one of his earmuffs off. "Are you David?" "That's me," I said pleasantly. "Morning, officers. Welcome back. What seems to be the problem today?" "The problem," the older cop yelled, trying to be heard over the wind, "is that you are operating an air raid siren in a residential zone. Dispatch has received 42 calls in the last hour. People think we're under attack." "You cannot have an industrial siren hooked to a garden windmill," Gary from Code Enforcement barked, stepping forward, brandishing his clipboard like a weapon. "It is a blatant violation of Nuisance Ordinance 8.14. I am issuing you a massive fine, and I am ordering the immediate confiscation of that device." I sighed, shaking my head with a look of profound disappointment. "Gary, I honestly expected better from code enforcement. You guys should really know your own municipal codes." Gary narrowed his eyes. "Excuse me? You're citing Ordinance 8.14, correct?" I asked. "Yes, nuisance and noise decibel limits," Gary snapped. "Did you read subsection C?" I asked, pulling a meticulously organized, tabbed folder out from under my arm. I handed it to Gary, specifically the exemptions clause regarding registered emergency safety devices. Gary took the folder, looking confused. He opened it up. "You see," I explained, projecting my voice so Brenda and the cops could hear every single word. Municipal Code 12.4, Section B, cross-referenced with Texas State Government Code, clearly states that decibel limits, structural utility requirements, and residential nuisance restrictions do not apply to the installation, testing, or operation of registered emergency meteorological warning devices. Gary stared at the highlighted text I had provided. His face paled slightly. "And if you look at the next page, Gary," I continued smoothly, "you will see the official, stamped, and approved registration forms from your very own office, filed yesterday morning. My windmill is no longer an unpermitted structural nuisance. It is the designated power source and trigger mechanism for a fully registered, city-approved high-wind meteorological safety alert system installed by licensed contractors, up to code." Gary flipped the page. He stared at the city stamp. He stared at his own department's approval signature. He looked up at me, then over at the yellow siren, and then back down at the paperwork. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on a landmine. He actually filed it correctly," Gary muttered, looking at the older police officer. It's exempt. The ordinance clearly exempts weather warning sirens." "Exempt!" Brenda screeched, her voice cracking into a register that only dogs should be able to hear. "What do you mean, exempt? It's a noise violation. It's making my ears bleed. Make him turn it off." "Ma'am," Gary said, his voice trembling slightly. "Under the law, he doesn't have to. It's legally classified as a safety device. It's technically no different than a smoke detector, legally speaking. We don't have the authority to make him dismantle it if it's operating as registered." The older cop looked at me. A slow, deeply impressed smile spread across his face beneath his mustache. He knew exactly what I had done. He knew why I had done it. And he knew it was utterly, brilliantly bulletproof. "So," the cop said, crossing his arms and leaning back, "looks like this isn't a police matter, or a code enforcement matter." "No!" Brenda yelled, stomping her foot on my driveway like a petulant toddler. "This is unacceptable! I will sue the city! I will sue you! I will have you evicted!" Right on cue, the wind picked up. Click. Wah! The siren ripped through the air again. Gary flinched and shoved his earmuffs back on. The cops winced. Brenda covered her ears, tears of absolute frustration streaming down her face. We all just stood there in my driveway for 45 seconds, being blasted by the deafening roar of malicious compliance, waiting for the wind to die down. When it finally stopped, Brenda looked utterly broken. Her tactical visor was slightly askew. Her sensible shoes looked less aggressive and more defeated. "Please," she rasped, her voice hoarse. "Please, just turn it off. I can't take it anymore." I looked at her. I let the silence hang in the air for a long, heavy moment. "You know, Brenda," I said softly, walking over to her, "I'm a reasonable guy. I never wanted this. I just wanted my little wooden windmill to spin in the breeze and power my garden lights. I liked the quiet. I liked the peace." She sniffled, looking down at the concrete. "But you couldn't handle the quiet, could you?" I continued. "You had to find a problem. You had to weaponize the city government because of a shadow flicker. You escalated this. I just followed the rules." "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Just please shut it off." I can install a manual override switch, I said, pulling one final document out of my folder. I can flip that switch, and the siren will never go off again. The windmill will just go back to being a quiet, pretty piece of wood. But I'm only going to wire that kill switch under one condition. I handed her the paper and a pen. This is a legally binding, notarized cease and desist and property enjoyment agreement, I explained. My lawyer drafted it up this morning. By signing this, you agree to drop all current and future complaints regarding my property, my structures, my landscaping, and my existence. You agree to never call code enforcement on me again. If you violate this agreement, not only will I sue you for harassment, but I will flip that siren back on, and I will leave it on. Brenda stared at the paper. She looked at Gary. Gary shrugged, completely washing his hands of the situation. She looked at the cops. The older cop tipped his hat at her. She snatched the pen from my hand and furiously scrawled her signature at the bottom of the page. Excellent, I said, taking the paper back and checking the signature. Pleasure doing business with you, Brenda. Have a wonderful, safe, and quiet day. She turned around and stormed back to her house, slamming her front door so hard I thought the glass would break. Gary shook his head, handed my folder back to me, and walked back to his truck without saying another word. The two cops lingered for a second. You know, the older cop said, pulling his sunglasses down, that is the most ridiculous, petty, magnificent thing I have seen in 20 years on the force. Just doing my part for High Wind Safety Officer, I replied with a grin. Have a good one, Dave, he laughed, getting back into his cruiser. I walked back into my backyard, grabbed my toolbox, and wired the manual override kill switch I had prepared the night before. I flipped the switch down, permanently cutting the 220-volt power to the siren. The windmill kept spinning in the relentless Amarillo wind, completely silent, utterly harmless, and absolutely victorious. The yellow siren is still up there, though. I never took it down. I left it bolted to the top of the wooden frame, a silent, terrifying monument to the consequences of weaponizing bureaucracy. Every time Brenda looks out her kitchen window, she has to look at it. She has to remember what happens when you push someone who actually reads the rulebook. Honestly, I think it really ties the yard together. So, what did we learn today? If you try to complain about the gentle whisper of a wooden windmill, be prepared for the heavy metal scream of malicious compliance. If you want to use the law as a sword, make sure your opponent isn't using it as a 130 decibel shield. Stay sovereign, my friends.